You can keep reminiscing, but
No. We don't want to make
save
it
it
too
for the
clubby. That's
audience.
boring.
Save
We
it
don't want
for
to
the
make it too sort
audience,
of
okay?
inside baseball. People get bored and they like old people hang around the bar. Tell me when we're on.
There we go. You're live now. Go ahead.
Okay. It's John Florescu. I am in Bucharest right now, and I welcome Ambassador Peter Galbraith, who's, I think, in Vermont, if I'm not mistaken, and Jim Rosapep, our former ambassador to Romania, who's, I don't know, on the screen, but anyways, with us in this conversation. By way of background, Peter was born in Boston, where I'm come from, in 1950. He attended Harvard University and then was at Oxford University at St. Cat's or St. Catherine's, if I'm not mistaken, and then at Georgetown Law School. He is the son of the well-known, these days you have to say these things as people forget everything, but the son of the very well-known and perhaps one of the most influential economists of the 20th century, a Canadian-born John Kenneth Galbraith, who worked for the president as an advisor, and then later was named ambassador to India. And I think he wrote a book about that, if I'm not mistaken. Peter, is that right?
He did, Ambassador's Journal.
Ambassador's Journal, which was a very amusing, and I remember an amusing comment. He said he was, I don't know if it was in the Journal or elsewhere, but he said he was always trying to write directly to the president and get by Dean Rusk, who was screening everything. And he said getting past Dean Rusk was like fornicating through a mattress. Is that right?
Communicating through the State Department was like fornicating through a mattress. What precisely happened is that the State Department kept complaining about his communicating directly with the president. So the National Security Advisor pulled him aside and said, well, what do you the president's going to ask you about this. And so my father thought of a response, and he had to think of one that would appeal to Kennedy. So Kennedy raised it, out of loyalty to Rusk. And my father said, communicate through the State Department is like fornicating through a mattress. And of course, Kennedy liked that so much that was the end of that. He continued to write directly to Kennedy.
I see. It's a very funny line. Well, that journal was fantastic. Well, I haven't actually seen Peter in 50 years since at Oxford days. So I read up on him, obviously in anticipation of the interview. And kind of like your father, you worked in diplomacy, international affairs, obviously at the Senate Foreign Relations senior staff person there, which I knew about. And then you wrote the Prevention of the Genocide Act in 1988, plus a number of books, plus a number of articles, and highly commented on. I didn't quite realize how controversial and far, it reminded me almost like Teddy Roosevelt's life. There were so many aspects to it with kind of daredevil personal diplomacy, putting yourself on the line, putting your life at risk. What do you make of this? When you look back on your own life, you're relatively young at my age or so. What do you make of this extraordinary career that ends up in domestic politics?
Well, I would say there was a foray into domestic politics rather than ending up, because I'm continuing now mostly to do international things. But I've sort of thought about this, and a great deal of it is just chance. And perhaps also seeing, moving away from the conventional wisdom, incidentally, a term my father coined, and it just with a different set of eyes. So part of what you cited was the prevention of genocide and a long involvement with the Kurds. And at the time that I first went to Iraq, and into Iraqi Kurdistan. This was 84 and 87. 87, I stumbled over the beginning of the genocide against the Kurds. Nobody knew who the Kurds were. I mean, aside from, some specialists, but they were just not a factor. But you could see things that were going on there, including the systematic destruction of all Kurdish villages, that at least led me to think that the conventional wisdom, which was that we needed to be supporting Saddam and that Saddam could be, the next Sadat, the guy who was going to turn against the Soviet Union, as well as a bulwark against Iran, that wasn't right. And of course, in August 2nd, 1990, he invaded Kuwait. A long involvement with Pakistan, obviously, that was friendship. with Benazir, but also just going against the conventional wisdom that we needed to be deeply in bed with Zia-ul-Haq, who was a thug, the longtime military dictator of Pakistan. I mean, again, the kind of guy who overthrows a democratic government, perhaps a flawed one, but nonetheless democratic, executes the man he overthrew, engages in all sorts of brutal activities and repression, and yet we gave him a big embrace. And my argument was always that that was not going to build a long-term relationship with Pakistan, and that we would be better off with a democratic government. And then nobody would talk to Benazir in those days. After she got out of prison in '84, and she credits me with getting her out of prison.
No, we'll talk about that.
She came to the U.S. She stayed in my apartment in Washington. I took her around to meet people on Capitol Hill. Percy, the chairman of Foreign Relations, Pell, the ranking member, the people on the House side. Nobody in the State Department would see her. Mm-hmm. They had a ban on talking to Bhuttos, but also a great deal of it was talking to her, to help her develop a message that was going to be winning with the Reagan administration, the American right, and her message was, a democratic Pakistan will be a more reliable ally against the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. So I don't know. It's just the real business is just seeing opportunities and perhaps not being overwhelmed by the conventional wisdom.
Yeah, I mean, just to leave your father behind here, because no one always talks about their fathers, about you, but given your father's acute eye on things, what is the best advice your father ever gave you? Did you listen to him very much?
Well, he was not short on giving advice. And so I, of course, like any son and a son growing up in the 60s, I didn't always listen to him. But in terms of advice, I think one of there are many pieces of advice, and as I reflect on the advice he gave, almost all of it was right. There were one or two points where I felt he was wrong in terms of his advising on issues that I was working on. But the one of the core bits of advice is that outrage and anger are much less effective than irony and humor. So when I wrote my books on Iraq, which were considered, David Brooks described them as the most devastating critique of the Bush administration. Yeah. I didn't do Bush lied, people died. I simply looked at their utter lack of planning for what they would do once they got to Baghdad, and at their incompetence, hiring people to run Iraq off of a list kept by the Heritage Foundation of people who had been applying to the Heritage Foundation for jobs. Spending their time coming up with new traffic laws for Baghdad. It was these sorts of things, and of course, it made a kind of critique that nobody could counter. I mean, nobody could sit there and say, "God, that was right. We got those traffic laws there." So I think that was one of the very good bits of advice. The other thing that I come to believe ever more strongly, is an opposition to war as a means of accomplishing goals. That said, I mean, there are times when you are involved. I am a strong supporter of helping Ukraine, but many other cases, that the real problem is that all these things have unintended consequences, and if you live long enough, as we have, you realize the world turns. I think when we were all younger, and I know you, John, were both very involved in Romania. It kind of looked like the division of Europe was permanent.
Yeah, that's correct.
And then all of a sudden it was gone. And that's what you come to realize. And so you don't want to do things that are going to be so destructive that when the world turns, thank God we didn't have a preemptive nuclear strike on the Soviet Union, which people in the 50s were talking about.
You talk about the world turning, and you talk about the passage of time, and in a way, your father came into life at a time of the new frontier, of great optimism, of the positiveness of the Kennedy rhetoric, pay any price, bear any burden, all that kind of stuff. And now in a new presidential phase, what do you, when you put your mind to the journey that the presidency has gone through, here we stand at a awkward moment, is to put it politely, worldwide. If you're anywhere worldwide, people always ask you what's going on in the United States with your head standing up. What do you make of this evolution? The optimism, the positiveness of the 60s to what we've got today?
Well, there are a couple of points I would make. The first is that it turns out political assassinations have huge consequences. If Kennedy had not been killed in Dallas, or Robert Kennedy had not been killed in Los Angeles, I think we would be in a very different world today. Yeah. So even a single act like that can, it has changed the course of our country.
Yeah.
In terms of the, optimism, I mean, at least for me, the optimistic period, and for Jim as well, I'm sure, was the Clinton administration. We were the absolute kings of the world. When I was ambassador to Croatia during the war there, and at times, when I was talking to people, giving, telling them what we wanted, it was almost like, there was the voice of God, because they were so desperate for help to get them out of the war. Now they wouldn't always do what I said. Of course, what I said was what the U.S. government, what the administration wanted me to say, mostly. But they wouldn't necessarily do it. But they would never come out and say, no, that's wrong. They would almost be, the will is there, but the flesh is weak kind of response to whatever it was that we were saying. We want to do this, but we can't. Not that you're wrong. And in that extraordinary moment, look at what we accomplished. We did bring Europe's deadliest war since 1945 to an end. That was the wars in Bosnia and Croatia, and then we obviously stopped the atrocities in Kosovo. It led to the we solved the problem of East Timor, was the denuclearization of Europe, with Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, moment of extraordinary cooperation with Russia. And then I would argue, time of just arrogance and ignorance, we threw it all away, beginning with the invasion of Iraq. And then, the erratic behavior that has characterized the United States since. I mean, there are other factors that, in the 1990s, China was not in anywhere near a peer power. It is. Russia was way down. It inevitably was going to come back. So we weren't going to always be as we were in the 90s, that supreme position. But nonetheless, we just squandered the opportunities that we had.
I mean, in both your cases, Jim, and in your case, Peter, the Clinton years was a wonderful. I mean, I read also that Clinton, I don't know if this is true, asked you specifically, or asked your team to help steer weapons to the benefit of, I forget which particular entity, and sidestep a little bit the ban that was put by the United Nations. In a way, you were operating with the kind of moral strength and authority. We remember people in Romania that planes were flying out of, doing sorties from Romania over Belgrade and so on. So you got yourself in delicate situations there, but with the moral authority as well.
Well, that particular story was a little more complicated.
Yeah.
Basically, what had happened was that we had negotiated an end to the fighting between Muslims and Croats in Bosnia. And so therefore, it built what was the beginning of an alliance and a federation between those two communities, which together constituted about 2/3 of the population of Bosnia. And they were then in alliance with Croatia up until this was March of 1994. The Croatians were supporting the Bosnian Croats in what was a three-way war. We, in essence, made it a two-way war, but that is to say between the Croatians and the Bosnians united against the Serbs. As a result of that, the Bosnian leaders went to the Croatian president and said, we know you're smuggling arms into Croatia. We would like to have arms come to Bosnia. The only way to get in is through Croatia. And some of these arms are going to be coming from Iran. And Tudjman, the Croatian president, didn't want to do that. This was a case where we had forced him to end his support of the Bosnian Croats. He always wanted to break up Bosnia. He wanted to have annex a good part of it to Croatia. So he thought that if he asked us for permission to permit these arms, particularly Iranian arms, Iran being the bad guy, that we would object. And in the end, this decision went to President Clinton, and he didn't say yes. He simply said, my instructions were to say I have no instructions, which of course actually required some explanation to Tudjman. He said, what does that mean? And, in the end, I had to say, well, notice what we're not saying, namely that we're not objecting. And so the arms began to flow. But there were really two issues there. One was enabling the Bosnians to defend themselves against aggression. And most of the arms did not come from Iran. Most of them came from other countries, particularly East European countries, because there was a big market for Soviet weapons, including from Russia. And secondly, if we had objected, it would have broken up the agreements, and that's what Tudjman had hoped would happen. So we had no role in facilitating any of the weapons.
Right.
It was simply, and we didn't even say yes, although by saying what we did, it was understood to mean that we were not.
I see. Well, I know that your detractors in the Republican side tried to use against you and Tony Lake and some others, and so I figured there's element of politics to the whole thing.
Well, it was hugely politics, because actually what they had done 6 months before my conversation with Tudjman was to pass a law prohibiting the U.S. from enforcing the arms embargo. So all I had done was to actually carry out the bill that had been promoted by Bob Dole, and their real complaint was that we did it 6 months before they made it the law. I guess it was 6 months after that they made it the law. In other words, we had already done the very thing that they had put into law. And the other funny thing about it was they then had 4 congressional hearings and 4 congressional committees in 1996 investigating all of this. And they started casting me in the role of Ollie North in all of that. And then that didn't go anyplace, although it was pretty nasty. But after the election, Tony Lake was then cast as Tony Lake was then nominated to head the CIA. And all of a sudden I was cast as the truth teller and Tony Lake as the villain. So it was really total politics.
Well, you maneuvered very well through it. You mentioned earlier Benazir Bhutto, and Benazir Bhutto, as most people know, was, I think, the first female president of a Muslim nation, and you knew her early on, and you knew her throughout life, and she died, I think, in 2007, around a bit before Christmas in 2007. And I was interested to see what she said about you, trying to understand you better. So I went to her book, and this is what she says. Peter Galbraith seemed shocking. This is you in college. His hair was long, he was dressed in old, untidy clothes, and he smoked cigarettes in front of his parents. It's a big deal. He looked more like a whale. I think I think she meant to say waif, but she says a whale. The former ambassador to India had brought home with him, rather than the son of a senior diplomat and a respected professor. So you were kind of like a guy who was a homeless child or something. But in many ways, when I reflect on your career, you've sort of done it your way to some extent. And there are any number of examples in any number of fields all across, Eastern Europe, all across the Balkans, and, out to Australia. Which one do you think best demonstrates your ability in foreign affairs or your feeling of accomplishment?
That's a very hard question to answer. In many ways, the most fun thing in my career was the 20 months that I spent in East Timor, 2000, 2001. After there was a referendum in 1999 on whether East Timor would remain part of Indonesia or become independent. The Indonesians had been telling the world just how much they'd done for East Timor, and they believed they would win the referendum. Little point here, the first victim of propaganda is always the propagandist. They believe their own arguments. They were shocked when 80% of the population voted against Indonesia for independence. They burned the country down. Literally, 3/4 of the buildings in East Timor were destroyed. About a third of the population had fled to West Timor. And the UN came in as the government of the interim government with full executive, legislative, and judicial authority. And I went out was seconded to be the charge of political, constitutional, electoral affairs. So everything we were doing was designing a country from scratch. Jim and I both actually have served in state senates in our respective states. Jim, were you on the finance committee too, or chaired it? Yeah, so I was on the finance committee. What you know is that when you're, in a place like established state, you're fiddling at the edges. Do you raise this rate by 0.5% or lower it, or do you provide this incentive? Well, everything we did was just completely from scratch. What legal system will apply? Indonesian, Portuguese in 1975 when they left, or Portuguese in 2000, and how would we even know what it was in 75? Do we make up our own? Do we have taxes? What taxes? What language to use? English. The Singaporeans came and said, do English. Portuguese, but nobody spoke Portuguese. Indonesian, but Indonesian was unacceptable. So, so it was really a lot. It was hugely fun. And eventually I became the first foreign minister of East Timor. And there was an interim.
I saw that, yeah.
And what was wonderful about it was not only was this broad scope, but in truth, there was no life and death in terms of what I did. The other things I've been involved in, obviously Croatia, Bosnia, the wars, deeply satisfying. But there's when human life and death is at stake, it's really different, and the stress is different. That was true, obviously, with the Kurds, who were victims of genocide, and even later, and with Pakistan. So, and with Afghanistan, those are the major places of my career. But so this was both wildly interesting and fun.
And in fact, I think you're one of the first, if not the first, at a certain level, to reveal the extermination of Kurdish villages. Is that correct, under Saddam?
Yes, or at least but yeah, I was certainly the first Westerner to encounter it, because it was a very funny story in 1987.
Yeah.
The Senate had switched from Republican to Democratic control. And this was the same time as Iran-Contra. So Senator Pell, the new chairman, wanted to not focus on the scandal part of it, but did it make sense for Reagan to be selling arms to Khomeini? Which the obvious answer was no. But and I was the person staffing that. But the Iraqi ambassador to the U.S. interpreted that as meaning I was pro-Iraqi, which really had to do with domestic U.S. politics. And so he said, any place in Iraq you want to go? So I said, okay, I want to go up to the Kurdish regions. And and he got Saddam's #2 to sign off on it. And so I went with Haywood Rankin, who was from the embassy. He spoke perfect Arabic, and he drove. And once we crossed from the Arab parts to the Kurdish parts, well, first at all the checkpoints, they couldn't believe we had the permissions, but hey, it was signed by Tayyip Yassin Ramadan. So what could they do? I mean, and what we saw, we had very detailed maps, and the places on the maps were no longer there. And then we could see that the process of systematically destroying all the villages, relocating people to what they called victory cities, but what in fact were concentration camps. And just one further point, it was that image that a year later, when reports came of refugees arriving in Turkey describing the use of chemical weapons, to me, I instantly knew that was true, because I could put that in the context of what I'd seen the year before. And there were a lot of people who were skeptical, but then I went back, I was home in Vermont, drove down, saw Senator Pell, describe this. I said, it's genocide. What should we do? He said, well, I said, let's do a sanctions bill. It may never become law, but at least introducing it will send a signal. I drafted the bill in about an hour, took it to, there was a committee hearing. He got Jesse Helms on board. In those days, it wasn't, could be motivated to join this. In fact, he was very good on it. And we got, Al Gore and Ted Kennedy and a few other Republicans, and we got it through the Senate in one day. Then, of course, it was opposed by the special interests who discovered how extensive it was in the Reagan administration. But then I went along the entire Iraq-Turkey border with one of the junior staffers on the committee, Chris Van Hollen, and we documented the use of chemical weapons. It was, and at that point, nobody challenged but that it had happened. The Reagan administration still said it wasn't serious enough to warrant punishing Saddam. 15 years later, the same people, Colin Powell and Dick Cheney, who had opposed even cutting off U.S. aid to Iraq over the use of chemical weapons, used it as a justification for the war against Iraq.
Yeah, I see. I mean, the whole idea of drawing lines in the sand, it seems like the United States has drawn lines in the sand one time too often. Do that, cross that line and you're in trouble. I mean, when Kennedy drew a line in the sand, or maybe in the ocean, when he said, don't allow these Russian Soviet ships to come closer to Cuba, people listened to it. Do you think, looking back in a way, that the United States' word, or its drawing lines in the sand on whatever particular thing, has been overused and in effect lost its impact, lost its potency?
Yes. I mean, I think that the real problem
Look at Syria, for instance.
Well, sorry, where were we going to say?
In Syria,
Well, no, I don't subscribe to what happened in Syria. In fact, there, Obama was very skilled. He had issued the threat, and as a result of that, and a result of an exchange that Kerry had in Moscow, or maybe it was St. Petersburg, the Syrians agreed to get rid of all their chemical weapons, and they basically did. So, the choice there was between a bombing, which, would have sent a signal, would have killed some people, but would have left Syria's chemical weapons stocks intact, and an agreement which led to them being destroyed. I mean, they may have kept a handful, but they were overwhelmingly destroyed. So I think that's also a point, is what is the point of ideology? I mean, to take these ideological positions. Another lesson I would say is focus on accomplishing the good rather than on just making a statement of position. And this is one of my lessons when I talk to people about any foreign policy decision. I say the first question has to be, will it work? If the answer to that is not yes, then there's no point in discussing whether it's moral or immoral, whether it's a good idea or bad idea. But too often we do the opposite. We say, we've got to take a stand here. We've got to do something. It's the right thing to do, or it's the ideological thing to do, and we don't then ask the question of will it work. If we'd asked the question of will it work before we invaded Iraq, I think we would have gotten a very different set of policies.
Now, if you take that same thinking, which reminds me of the bit of advice your father had, you mentioned your father gave to you, in Ukraine. Now we have a situation in Ukraine, and the question is, will it work? And there's certain subtle nuances in the Biden team. I think we'll take whatever it takes, or we'll do what we can. How do you think the lesson you just described, will it work when it comes to Ukraine? Why do you think continued U.S. support of Ukraine could work and do the trick?
I think there's been a misunderstanding, or maybe a failure to think through about how this war actually will end.
Yeah.
The assumption, and this goes actually to another of the assumptions in foreign policy. The assumption is that what is today is what's always going to be there. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I was just on a program listening to people say, well, even after Putin goes, the next guy will be just as bad or just as much of a nationalist. He might be somewhat more pragmatic. Well, we don't know that. So certainly in the case of Ukraine, we are supporting the Ukrainians to do what they want to do, which is to defend their country against a completely unjustified, undisguised act of aggression. If they succeeded, it would be the first a major violation of the underpinning of the entire post-World War II settlement, which mm-hmm. is that when you are a member of the United Nations and when your territorial, your boundaries are accepted, another country cannot invade you for the purpose of annexing your territory. And if mm-hmm. you think about it, there has not been one. There have been two wars, or two instances of that since 1945. Saddam invading Kuwait and trying to annex it, and the world came together, and he paid. The Kuwait's sovereignty right. was restored, and that the system was held in play. Held intact. So mm-hmm. here, if Russia is allowed to get away with the invasion of Ukraine and annexing Ukrainian territory, it really does undermine what the world order for nearly 80 years. And if you think about how it was before 1945, well, for centuries, wars were about countries invading other countries to take their territory. Mm-hmm. You sit in Bucharest, where in 1940, the Soviet Union came and took Bessarabia, now Moldova. So, that sort of thing has put an end to what was a major source of war. It's not all wars. They're different invasions, mm-hmm. ideological ones, Soviets in Afghanistan, US in Iraq, but they were not wars of annexation until this. So that's a critical principle. So, and where is this war going to go? Well, first, it may be a stalemate for a long period of time, but that is not going to be the acceptance of Russia's annexation, even if they hold on to Donetsk and Luhansk and the corridor to Crimea. Second, though, I think we need to think about how these wars end. Think about how the Vietnam War ended for the US. What is it that ended it? Or the Soviet war in Afghanistan, or the American war in Afghanistan? It is that elites in those countries turned against the war. And interesting, actually, also the children of the elites. It was people of our generation whose parents were in the Johnson administration, the Nixon administration, who were the protesting and turning around their parents' points of view. This was the Soviet Union over Afghanistan. It was mothers against the Afghan war. It was a sense on the part of people in the new elite by Gorbachev that this wasn't worth it. The American war in Afghanistan, again, a sense by the elites that including the Republicans, Trump, and so on, and Biden, but also people around it, that it wasn't worth the cost. And my guess is that, I mean, if you look, there was a wonderful, very interesting video of the National Security Council meeting in Moscow 2 days before the invasion of Ukraine.
I remember that. Yep, go on.
And you could see that, particularly the head of the FSB was not comfortable with this. That wasn't a guy who was saying, "Let's go, Putin."
Yeah.
No, he was, he was not on board at all. You have to think there are a lot of people who are not on board. Does that mean Putin's going to be overthrown, but by the end of the year? No. But at some point, there's likely to be change, and my guess is that people are just going to say, "Why are we killing Ukrainians? They look awful lot like us, and what is it that we really want to accomplish?" And our people are getting killed too.
Speaking of being not on board, and you're also having a very sharp eye on domestic politics. I mean, obviously in Vermont, I know you're going back to foreign affairs. What do you make of the argument that we hear across the United States is, "Oh, we can't afford it. It's too much. We've got our own problems." This sort of isolationist, Trumpist argument. How far is it going? Where do you see it? Do you think it could actually lead, to a turn off or a shut off of the kind of aid we've given to Ukraine so far?
It's a totally fake argument. It's an inconsequential amount of money compared to all the other things that we're spending money on. What is it? We've given, Jim may have the figures in his head, or you, but it's something around 100 billion to Ukraine, maybe 120 billion. Let's compare that to 3 trillion for Afghanistan, 5 trillion for Iraq.
That's interesting.
These are tiny amounts, and why? Because what's the difference? In Afghanistan and Iraq, we went in and we tried to impose our idea of what those countries should be like. And we failed utterly in Afghanistan. It wasn't so disastrous in Iraq because the Kurds refused to go along with what we wanted. And the Shia, who are the majority, the Iranians basically supported them, and they refused to go along. Here, but we sent all the troops, spent all the money. Here, we're doing what we did in Bosnia and Kosovo. We are supporting a local party to accomplish their objectives, not our objectives. There are no Americans fighting in Ukraine. It is the Ukrainians. And so this argument is not, and it's never been about the money. It's never been about the wisdom of supporting Ukraine. It has been pure politics of a part of the Republican Party, which is probably not isolationist. They are so intent on power that they are willing to sacrifice American values, American democracy, American national security interests in the interest of
That's a fascinating statistic about what we spent. I mean, that never comes up. And you just sort of feel like, you have people, all kinds of groups saying, we can't afford this, we can't afford that. We don't even know where Ukraine is. If you sit here on the eastern fringe of Europe, where a village, Kogličano, is the biggest U.S. base in Europe right now. When you go to Moldova today, when you go by the border of Transnistria, I think people are shaking in their boots. They're waiting, heavily on what's going to happen on November 5th. They're nervous about it. But you make a point. Jim, I know you might probably have a thing to say, or at least to clarify some of the statistics of aid, or a question. Jim?
Well, my question has been very fascinating, Peter, and thank you very much for joining us. Obviously, the people who watch these conversations are interested in the U.S. and Romania, and the context and the war in Ukraine, Putin's war in Ukraine, has made that much more dramatic today than it's been in a long time. I guess I'd like to focus a little more in on Moldova, because it's a small country. It's right between Ukraine and Romania. John had on the Moldovan ambassador about a month ago, getting his perspective on what's going on. I'd just be interested in your perspective on how Moldova fits into this in relation to Putin, in relation to Russia, in relation to Ukraine, in relation to Romania, in relation to Europe.
Well, it's a question that interests me a lot. And in May of 2022, I went to Moldova, met with the leaders there. And then I went back again in September with some British MPs, and we went to Odessa. And what concerned me was what would happen to Moldova if the Russians took Odessa. That's really the trigger that would put Moldova at great risk. Incidentally, both times I went to Transnistria.
And what's the trigger? What's the trigger, Peter? That's interesting. I never heard that before.
Well, if the Russians took Odessa, then they're right on the doorstep of Moldova.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's a way they can get to Moldova without taking Odessa first.
Yeah, I see.
I mean, just looking at the map. I mean,
Yeah.
And Odessa is absolutely one of their targets. Obviously, city founded by Catherine the Great on the Black Sea. Be a very beautiful place. If you're in the idea of Greater Russia, that would be what is a prime target. So the question is, how can Moldova respond? Well, in the there are lots of ways it can respond. Of course, it has one very fast path into NATO and the European Union, which is undo what happened in 1940.
Yeah, there's some discussions I noticed in Chisinau when I was there recently about how Romania could reabsorb Moldova into the old empire. There's resistance to that, but I can assure you that talking to 400 kids at the university in Chisinau, they stopped the conversation and said, "Can we ask you as an American, what's going through the minds of the Americans right now?" And you could hear a pin drop. And we're 42 miles from the Russian 10th Army at Transnistria, and they don't have NATO shield. So there's not a whole lot you can say right now, but they keep a stiff upper lip, such as the ambassador the other day.
Right. I mean, this is an option. And if you look at the precedent of what happened with German unification, yes, there was a four-power agreement, but that had nothing to do with whether the unified Germany was part of NATO or the European Union. That had to do with ending the occupation agreements from World War II. Neither the European community, as it then was, nor NATO approved the accession of East Germany to West Germany. Yeah. That was a German decision, and arguably the same thing would be true of a Moldova returning to Romania. The Transnistria makes it more complicated because that's not part of historic Moldova. But the interesting thing is if Moldova wanted to really screw Transnistria, it would do this because all of a sudden there'd be a Schengen border between Transnistria and Chisinau. That the only way you can get in and out of Transnistria, and I went there twice, is to go through Moldova. And you see that there are Transnistrian license plate cars, driving in Moldova, Moldovan ones in Transnistria. You go to any supermarket in Transnistria, basically all the goods are from Moldova. I went to the history museum, which was quite interesting in Transnistria. I wanted to pay in euros. They said, "No, could you pay in lei?" I mean, the worst thing that can happen to Transnistria would be for Moldova to say, "Forget it, you're not part of our country."
That's funny. That's very ironic.
Just to say one other thing.
Yeah.
I'm also very strongly of the view, why do people want to keep in their country people who don't want to be part of it? What benefit is there to Moldova of having Transnistria? It's unlike the rest of Moldova, whose population is overwhelmingly Romanian speaking. The Romanian population in 1991 was only a third. It's presumably significantly less today. It's not historically part of Moldova. And this is my view. Why does Iraq want to keep the Kurds? Why hold Yugoslavia together, the Soviet Union? God didn't create any country. And I guess that's another lesson I have, and much of my career has been in places that have broken up, but is where people in a geographically defined area, overwhelmingly and democratically want to be part of their own state.
I'd like to follow up on that question if I could, John. What brings to mind is the peaceful separation of Czechoslovakia, which happened during the term that you've been working in the region. What, given your experience in all kinds of different places, your view of let their people go if their people want to go doesn't seem to be widely embraced in the world. Why do you think it's such a problem? Why is it so hard to let folks who don't want to be in your country go?
I've thought about this. There's a certain sense of national pride. There's an attachment to that map, lines on the map, from people who have never been to those places on the map. But that somehow my country is weakened by it. And the experience is the exact opposite. It's very interesting. Masoud Barzani, who was president of the Kurdistan region, and which was voted overwhelmingly for independence in 2017, he made a trip around Europe and he went to Prague and to Bratislava. And in both places, they said to him, our relations are so much better than when we were one country. Our cabinets, we have monthly meetings of the two cabinets, and it's very cooperative. In the old days, when the cabinet met, it was always a big fight. And this is another part of the world, particularly of Europe. We have two trends. One is the trend of multinationalism, or the European Union. And the European Union is not just about the countries that are in the European Union, but it has an effect on countries that are adjacent to it. And so the fact that you're pulling all this together in what is in essence a federal state also makes separatism possible. I mean, think about Catalonia. If Catalonia became independent, how would you even notice? The currency would still be the euro. It'd still have an EU passport. They'd have EU license plates. It'd all be part of the common market. There wouldn't be any border controls, all part of Schengen. Anybody from Spain would continue to work in Catalonia and vice versa, or any place else in the European Union. Really wouldn't make difference. What made possible the breakup of Yugoslavia in 1991 was this greater European space. Imagine Slovenia had wanted to become independent in 1919. Well, it would have been a country of less than 1 million. It would have been at risk of being attacked by Austria or Italy. Nobody from Slovenia would be able to travel because of all the visa and passport requirements. And if you were a Slovene, you would have to worry that one day a bunch of non-commissioned officers would get drunk. They'd go to the royal palace, or they'd go to the president's palace, shoot it up, and declare one of them to be King Janos I. Well, by 1991, none of that was possible. You think it's funny, but of course that's what happened in Albania, King Zog.
Yeah, exactly.
So it is this common European space and common global space that has also made it possible for people to have their own states.
Yeah, to some extent, Switzerland's a reflection of that, where you have different languages, you have different traditions. When I was talking with Dennis Ross a while back, he was explaining a concept of American policy, and given the fact that you began your career in foreign affairs and continuing it now in foreign affairs, he said there are two levers to U.S. policy. One lever is our principles, and the second lever is our interests. And sometimes the United States pulls on the interest levels. Sometimes it pulls on the levers of principles, like he is saying in the case of Romania, getting along with Ceausescu, even though he was a dirty rat in Romania, but we needed to pull something away from the Soviet Union. Romania was useful. What do you make of that concept, of that interpretation of what drives U.S. foreign policy in the years that you've been in it?
Uh, well, a couple of points. First, if I could say a word about Ceausescu, because my first visit to Romania was in August of 1968. I'd spent 10 weeks traveling around the Soviet Union in VW buses with a bunch of college students. I was still in high school. And I split off from the group with a friend. We were in the Moldova part of Romania and Transylvania. And as we were approaching the border with Hungary, the conductor came in to say the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia, and they locked us on the train, and we went, the Hungarians wouldn't let us in because they were part of the invasion. And Ceausescu was a great national hero.
Yeah, he was.
So people need to remember. And at the time that we were, that we were having these good relations with Ceausescu, it wasn't so clear what his character was. When Nixon went to, I think it was Nixon's first foreign visit.
Yeah,
so I would make that point. Second, though, I would say actually principles and interests do coincide. And when you forget the principles for what you perceive as the interest, you end up in trouble. Let me give you the examples. The embrace of Zia, this brutal military dictator of 11 years in Pakistan. That was supposedly in our interest, but a complete violation of our principles. Meanwhile, what did he do? He Islamicized Pakistan. He created the radicals in Afghanistan who eventually attacked the United States in 2001. Thank you very much, Charlie Wilson. But those guys that you were promoting, because Zia was promoting, there were alternatives in Afghanistan. But Zia went over the hardliners. They were the ones who came back and got us. Look at the embrace of Saddam Hussein. It ought to have been obvious that a guy who launched an unprovoked attack on his neighbor Iran, who used chemical weapons against the Iranians for the first time since the World War I, who gassed his own people, who engaged in such brutal killings, that this was not going to be a reliable ally. And yet he was embraced as a mainstay of American interests. We would have done better to have stayed there with our principles. The other thing is that it can appear that principles and interests are very separate. I mean, people argued in Bosnia that we really had no interest. It was a matter of principles that we couldn't stand seeing people in Sarajevo being gunned down by snipers in a European capital, women in high heels and short skirts crossing the street and being shot down. But the Bosnia War became a metaphor for European weakness and for American weakness. So even though there wasn't any great strategic interest, the principle of not allowing those kinds of war crimes against humanity take place to end a war in Europe, that actually ended up strengthening the United States in a huge way. So even in the absence of perceived interest in a situation, in fact, there is an interest in respect for human rights, for international law, for civil behavior, not having war crimes.
Right. So it goes back to your kind of Ukraine argument to some extent. That is our principles at stake. We have a few minutes left. I'm curious about your foray into domestic politics, because that's about the time when I lost track of you. And so I had a friend dig you up. He said, oh, and then I actually dug into your campaign platform in 2016, which I won't read now, but campaign themes of 2016. What did you learn because you and Jim are kind of in the same boat here. What did you learn being a state legislator and a senator? And how is that different from what you learned being a man around town with a lot of influence in Washington?
Well, look, I love Vermont. It was always my home, and so it was a pleasure to serve my state. I ended up there because of the controversy in Afghanistan. I was recalled for having taken the view that there ought to be some connection between votes cast and results announced in the Afghan presidential elections, and the UN didn't agree, and I ended up being recalled. Instantly, my argument was not just honest elections are a good idea. My argument was very pragmatic. If you have a counterinsurgency depends on a partner, and the guy Karzai is already corrupt and ineffective and now illegitimate, it's not going to work. And incidentally, I wasn't wrong. So I thought I'd participate in an election with 100% correlation between votes cast and results announced. And at least in my campaign for the Senate,
Yeah.
I prevailed with a much larger percentage of the vote than Karzai without cheating. But hey, who am I comparing myself to? But in the Senate, I think there are a couple of approaches you can take. There are guys who are in the system and tinker around the edges. And I just decided I didn't, really care whether we allowed people to sell sandwiches outside the grocery store without having a bathroom. It's not unimportant to the guy selling the sandwiches, but okay. So I focused on some of the bigger issues. We passed a single-payer healthcare system. I produced the financing plan. It didn't become law because people wanted to vote for a single-payer healthcare system, but they didn't want to actually have to pay for it. But
Right.
to me, you had to bring this forward. I did a bill that became law in a much weaker version, which basically set aside huge tracts of forest land in Vermont, protecting it forever from development. And it was enacted in a weak version, and now more recently it's been strengthened. So and that's another thing. I mean, diplomacy is particularly if you're dealing, as I have been, in crisis situations, Afghanistan, Iraq, the Balkans, East Timor. It's a very dynamic situation, and you can accomplish a lot in short periods of time. In a legislature in a established normal state like Vermont or Maryland, a great deal of what you do is just incremental, and that's fine. I mean, that's how it should be. I would like to touch on one other thing, if you'll indulge me, because like many people, I've been concerned about the state of American democracy. I'm sure Jim did this. There we were in countries that had newly emerged from communism. And, part of our job was to talk about the features of democracy. And what would I talk about? Well, the importance of an independent, nonpartisan judiciary, the importance of when you lose an election, accepting the results. I would be embarrassed to give those speeches today. I have to tell you, I'm particularly concerned about the Supreme Court. And that goes back to the 2000 Bush v. Gore decision, because those 5 Republican Supreme Court members would not have stopped the recount had Gore been ahead of Bush.
No, that's true.
And, what is it you expect of a court? Same law, same facts, same result, regardless of political party of the plaintiff or the defendant. That didn't exist. And what we've had since. How would we lecture? How would I teach students about constitutional law? How do you amend the U.S. Constitution? Well, you could, 2/3 of the House and Senate, 3/4 of the state, or just change a few justices of the Supreme Court. Roe v. Wade is the law of the land. Now it isn't. Well, with a few more terms of Democratic presidents, they're going to campaign on, we're going to reinstate Roe v. Wade. Is that really how we should be running our country? And never mind the direct assault on democracy represented not by the mob on January 6th, but by the fact that a vast majority of duly elected Republican members of Congress voted to overturn an election that was indisputably free and fair, and without considering what the consequences would be. Suppose they'd succeeded. Would we all be accepting that? I mean, it would have been just a disaster for our country.
So effectively, you're saying that something's gone awry in the American public.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily blame the American public. I would frankly, I'd blame the political leadership. And to be honest, it's not equal. I'm going to blame the political leadership in the Republican Party.
Right. Jim, a closing comment, because I think we're all in the same boat here. So, but maybe you have a final. We have another minute to go.
Well, picking up on the concerns that Peter's expressed, which obviously people on, I will find both sides of the aisle have those concerns. I know that very, very well. Is when I saw President Iohannis, the current outgoing president of Romania, in the United States in 2017, which was soon after January 6th and all the controversy around that, I said, it's such a pleasure, and I meant this sincerely, to be in the presence of the president of a stable democracy. And that's Romania.
Well, Well, that's a positive note. And anyways, Peter, I have to say, sorry calling you Peter all the time. I should call you Mr. Ambassador since we're in a public forum to some extent. But I think your career has actually been remarkable, and I admire your ability to stand by your guns time and time again. To some extent, you seem like you were the enfant terrible of every institution in Washington and somewhat elsewhere. And I think it's very much to your credit listening to you now. And thanks for joining us.
That's very kind. Just a last word, because I don't want people to get the wrong idea.
Yeah.
You know, it was effective. I mean, after all, I would not have had the career I did if I had just been a troublemaker or enfant terrible.
Yeah.
And that's an important point. You can stand for principle. You can make the case if you do it in the right way, and you can have a very good career. Maybe if I'd been more of a conventional wisdom person, I would have gone higher, but I did pretty well.
And you look well too. So I hope to see you sometime soon in Vermont.
I do. Please, you're both welcome.
Fantastic. Thanks again for coming.